presentation and hear discussion from a panel of transportation and transit experts and stakeholders as we explore the metro region's needs now and in the future. As all of you know, TwinWest has actively been engaged in supporting and advocating sound transportation and transit investments, including Southwest Light Rail Transit, preserving suburban bus transit systems, adding a third lane on 494 in Plymouth, expanding Highway 100 in St. Louis Park, and extending 610 in Brooklyn Park. And obviously there seems endless transportation needs. In 2013, the governor and legislature will consider how we can catch up to the regions we compete with for jobs by accelerating transportation and transit plans. They will also consider substantial changes to how we pay for this infrastructure going forward. Jay Coles of the Itasca Project will present on the country's first private sector return on investment assessment of the regional transit system. You all will have a copy of a recent opinion piece in the Pioneer Press from Jay Coles and Charlie Zelli, who was just named by Governor Dayton this past Wednesday as the new head of the Minnesota Department of Transportation, resulting from their work on the Itasca's project study, as well as the executive summary of that study for your review. So take a look at that, and please take it with you. We will also hear from Metropolitan Council Chair Susan Hay on recent recommendations from the Governor's Transportation Finance Advisory Committee and what that could mean for future funding options. Will Schroer of the Minneapolis Regional Chamber and St. Paul Area Chamber will present the proposed program of projects and how the business community is weighing in on this issue as it relates to our region's competitiveness and economic future. The presentation then will be followed by a panel moderated by Will Schroer to talk about recent funding proposals and more about what will certainly be a hot topic during the 23 legislative session. So our panelists will be Jay Coles, Itasca Project, Metropolitan Chair Susan Hay, State Senator Terry Bonoff, and Hennepin County Commissioner Jan Callison. So with that, I would like to invite our esteemed presenters and panelists to join us on stage, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to Jay Coles for his presentation. So please give a warm TwinWest welcome to our
Good morning. I grew up in Long Lake and have lived in and worked in Minneapolis much of my life. I now live in St. Paul. And so I share that because returning here feels like ground zero. In fact, for those of you with a memory, this is really the site of the Cooper movie theater. Do you remember the Cooper? And right across the street was Braemar Ice Arena, which was one of the very first covered ice rinks. Things change. I'm going to move very quickly. You've got a terrific panel here today, so save your questions. That's really what we want to hear about. I'm going to try and deliver a report. There is a summary of that report on your tables. Please take that away and study at your leisure. I represent a group called Itasca Project. We were formed about 10 years ago as kind of an ad hoc in the sense that we're not a very formal group of business leaders along with our peers in politics, in education, the foundation community, with an eye towards looking at regional issues. We felt that there was sort of a vacuum of discussion and consideration about where the metro region as a whole ought to be placing its priorities. And as we looked at the world, we felt that increasingly the economic competitive set is not a particular political jurisdiction, but it's really a set of assets that often comes to be defined as what's the metro region's assets, what are its qualities and characteristics. These are the priorities that we're focused on. You can see generating high-quality job growth, advancing comprehensive and aligned transportation system. I'll talk about a particular part of that today. And also our region's education system. And at the core of all of our projects, we're attempting to raise the economic competitiveness of the metro region and to address, ideally eliminate the disparities that exist within the region. We undertook a study that we're calling the ROI Transit Study about 2 years ago with the purpose that often the conversation about transit and about transportation in general involved huge upfront investment numbers and then a kind of murky, undefined future of benefits that seem to always not be quite adequate to offset the scale of that initial investment. So we thought, listen, this is a business group. Let's deal with it in a familiar manner to us. Let's look at it through the lens of a return on investment analysis. We went out and found the best national firm that we could, and we got a local technical advisory committee to challenge all the assumptions and come up with the best case. We wanted to be a conservative business case, practical. This is not a political exercise on our part. We wanted to see what the research could tell us about this. So we asked 3 questions. If we built out the existing plan, and there is an existing plan, you'll see it in a minute, called the 2030 plan, which essentially defines a full transit system, ideally by the year 2030, what would be the return on that investment? If we were able to accelerate that investment and complete it, let's say, in 10 years, by 2023, would that change the returns? And then, in fact, if the private marketplace found that the establishment of those transit corridors attractive and began to concentrate private sector development more around the transit corridors than we currently are expecting that growth to occur, would that further provide a return for the transit users? And here are the 4 scenarios. In our base case is essentially saying we just complete the central corridor, and that is the extent of our transit system, existing buses, of course. The 2030 plan that I just described, including 3 new LRT lines, we might imagine Southwest and Botno and 1 more, 4 completed BRT corridors and 9 arterial BRTs. We're not attempting to give you a precise description of which ones these may be. This is schematic in a sense, and obviously as time goes by, we want to get the right technology in the right corridor in the right location. And then you can see scenarios 2 and 3 as I described. Here's the map that typically is shown of the 2030 system. You can see a lot of dashed lines. Well, there's lots of different colors going on there, but essentially this is the description that I just gave you, with the understanding that our analysis doesn't presume every possibility, but this critical mass of what we think a complete transit system for the metro area would look like. We calculated 6 kinds of benefits: vehicle operating costs, travel times, shippers and logistics cost, emissions, safety, and road pavement conditions. And I want to point out at the bottom there, our analysis presumes not only the capital investment, but all of the operating and maintenance costs of all of these corridors and equipment for the full period that we're evaluating. So we're actually evaluating a period from essentially today through the year 2045, very long term. So we're presuming that in the base case, the system would be built by 2030 and then would be in operation for 15 years. And it's those cash flows out over the whole 15 years that we're discounting back to give us an evaluation. So it's very conservative, all dollars in. And you might also note that what is not included here is any kind of imputed economic growth. We're not saying to you, build this and the region is going to change its economic trajectory. We might imagine that, we might hope for that. There's all kinds of benefits we think might come. But these are the ones that we know we can measure. These are the ones that we know from research are going to be realizable savings, essentially, as a result of the transit system. Before I get to that, and I want to underline one other thing. The primary effect that occurs when you build out a transit system is not only do you draw people to the transit system who are able to achieve their transportation choices or needs successfully, but you move a large number of cars off the roads. So much of the impact in terms of benefits is actually derived by auto users. They get there faster, they get there more predictably, and the savings that are imputed from that saved time is the large portion of the return that occurs here. The reason I point this out is when we talk about transit, we're talking about a whole transportation system. It really is related. So what we're in fact saying in some respect in terms of these returns, build a transit system and our whole highway system works more effectively. It's a little bit like adding a few major veins or arteries in our body. If we do it in the right place, in the right modality, it means all the blood flow is faster throughout the body system, and including the entire road system, particularly. So here are the returns that we achieved. As you can see, they're significant. Even though the investment dollars, 4.3 billion, 5.2 if we accelerate, and the reason why it's greater if we accelerate is not because capital costs are higher or there's more debt. In fact, this is a terrific time to borrow if you have to borrow, but that we have a longer period of time since the construction happens fast, a longer period of time of costs associated with operating and maintaining the system. So there are greater costs associated with an accelerated plan over the period that we're measuring. And then, of course, if in fact the private sector moves towards development around these corridors in anything other than just the status quo, we would find an additional benefit. And you can see, and from your own experience as business people, these are significant returns. These would, in most companies, readily surpass the hurdle rate of the cost of equity or debt. And you can see here the impacts by category. And again, number one is the primary, and two relate to the highway system in particular. These are the savings. This is what would occur within our road and highway system as a result of this investment. But there's a couple of other critical benefits. One is particularly important to business people. With the investment in a complete system and with the efficiencies gained in the road system, we would actually open up significant parts of our labor force to our employers as potential employees. That is to say, we would increase the size of the labor force within a 30-minute commute of the businesses within the metro area. Essentially, without recruiting people to move here, without growing the population, we achieve a 22 or 25% increase in the effective available labor force for employers to consider. And that's going to be a terribly valuable advantage as we face our retirement cliff, as it were, with baby boomers and the need to replace talent and find workers. And that's going to be a very competitive game playing out all across the nation. In addition, we do not include in our analysis, but needs to be noted, there is $4.3 billion of construction spending occurring, and that, of course, has multiplier effects. We do not apply those. We also, for the period that this is being constructed, there's 30,000, I would say 30,000 FTE job years, not 30,000 full-time jobs, but 30,000 FTE job years over the course of construction. Very, very significant from an employment standpoint. We also, as part of our analysis, went and talked to a number of businesses. A number of these are Southwest Corridor potential businesses. We talked to their HR and their facility managers. And this, I suspect, is familiar to many of you. Transit is important for employees. And increasingly with younger employees, it is a desirable form of transportation. It's interesting. When I grew up, freedom as a young person was based on having a car. Mobility was the source of freedom. In today's world, freedom for a 19 to 35-year-old is very often in the form of a smartphone, a wireless hotspot, and a laptop. And in Denver, when we visited Denver this past fall as part of the inner-city leadership visits that the Minneapolis-St. Paul Chambers put on, the Denver business leadership told us that in their experience, there's a significant number of younger people that would prefer to tweet or text than drive. It's not a matter of doing both. They want to be working their laptop or their smartphone. So it is significant. It's going to grow in significance. What we also know is that in some respects, higher density is valuable for certain kinds of businesses. Transit permits that. But very importantly, transit has to be considered not on a line-by-line or as a separate modality. It needs to be integrated into the complete transportation system. And very often those last connections are crucial. So here are the points that came out of our study. The Itasca project per se is assessing how we want to take advantage of this study in our own efforts. But for the purpose of the business community, we wanted to get this out and share it, and I welcome your questions later on today. Thanks. Good luck getting going.
Well, thank you very much. I am going to give you a little bit of a background about the Transportation Finance Advisory Committee. I'm Sue Hagan. I'm the chair of the Metropolitan Council. I was appointed to serve on the Transportation Finance Advisory Committee. It was a committee that Governor Dayton asked then Commissioner Sorrell, the Commissioner of MnDOT, to put together business leaders, public officials from throughout the state to assess and look at the needs for transportation, both roads and transit, and come up with recommendations for how do we finance and how do we meet those needs for the next 20 years. That was the time frame we were given. So the Transportation Finance Advisory Committee met all year last year, probably about 10 or 12 times in all-day meetings. We took input and received testimony from stakeholders, and it was really quite an experience to understand the transportation needs all over the state of Minnesota, and not just within the region with which I'm much more familiar. So our job was to come up with some recommendations to give to the governor and, of course, for our legislators as well. That report was just delivered about the 1st of December. And I'm going to talk about the various scenarios that we looked at. So we really looked at 4 scenarios, just assuming no additional funding for roads or transit, what I would call the status quo. Second, well, how could we at least get enough revenue to maintain the current mobility we have, because of course our region is growing all the time, which is a great thing. And then thirdly, what was an economically competitive scenario, and we also addressed world class, and that was really a pretty expensive option, and finally took that out of the options that we were recommending at the end. So we put together funding scenarios for each of these 3 levels, and I'll show you a little bit about what that was. I'm going to skip over some of the details here and get to the photos. So scenario 1 is basically the current for our transit system is basically this map here. And you can see that this map here shows what it is we have today and does not involve the investment that we need, for example, for our Southwest LRT line or for the Bottineau lines going forward. So that was scenario 1. That was basically current commitments and revenues, what would it allow us to do. Scenario 2, we assumed that to get to Scenario 2, to really increase our mobility so that we can keep up with some growth in the region, we would need to add a 1/4-cent sales tax for the region. In a 5-county, contributing to that, it raises about $100 million a year. That would allow us to expand our transit system, so the regular route bus service and arterial bus service by about 0.5% per year over the 20 years. So with that scenario, it's sort of trying to maintain mobility, have it not be worse than it is today. And that would require about this 0.5% increase in the whole overall bus system. You can see that would allow us to expand and build out the Southwest LRT line. That's down there, the green line down to the southwest on that map. Add some arterial bus rapid transit, which is a more cost-effective way to move people in areas of very high density. But it would not allow us to serve the entire region. So the third scenario we looked at which is a scenario that will require us to raise $4.2 billion, and you heard that number in Jay's presentation. We were anticipating that to do that, we would need an additional 0.5 cent increase in our sales tax. Today, there is a 1/4-cent sales tax that goes to support capital and a portion of operating for light rail, but not for buses. It supports light rail, some bus rapid transit, and commuter rail. So what this would be is a total of a 0.75 cent for sales tax for transit in the metropolitan area. And what that would allow us to do is really to get to that economic competitive level that Jay spoke to in his maps. It would allow us to grow the bus system by about 1% per year, which I think is still quite a conservative approach to growth for the region. It's actually a little less than the projected economic growth for the region over the next 20 years, which is about 1.5% per year. But you can see that we would have much better service, much better coverage, and the big dark colored lines in the scenario are the more capital intensive investments for transit. All the less visible lines, the gray lines there, are really the regular route bus service, which is critical to feed into a comprehensive and integrated transit system. So today, for example, 40% of users of our Hiawatha Light Rail line are taking bus to get to that line. So the integration of bus and rail is really how the transit system can work in the very best way. So this was a quick overview of the transit recommendations for the Transportation Finance Advisory Committee. The committee also made recommendations for an increase in the gas tax to support an investment in build-out of roads throughout the entire state of Minnesota. The amount that we recommended in the report overall for roads is about $16 billion over the 20 years, about $4.2 billion for the transit system. And that is really what the legislators, the governor, you, as business leaders, will have a chance to weigh in on during this next legislative session and perhaps the session after that. Not easy. It's expensive to make the investments that we need, but we think they're really critical. If you think about our region and the role that we play in the economy here for the state of Minnesota, I'm just going to give you a few statistics that are pretty important. 62% of the jobs in the state of Minnesota are within our 7 metro county region. And we are home to about 19 Fortune 500 companies here. So getting people around, getting people to work, getting people to school is going to be critical as we think about our state's potential to grow, attract talent, and to produce revenue that helps support all of the needs that we have in the state of Minnesota. I think, and we at Metro council do both transportation planning for roads and for transit. We, of course, operate the bus system through Metro Transit, but it's the integration of how we do roads and transit together in the region that is absolutely critical. The min-pass lanes really are a very cost-effective way of adding additional mobility in the region at a much lower cost than adding lanes of traffic. So these are the sorts of solutions that we are going to need to address in the future, and our projections for growth would require us to make those sorts of choices. And you're not going to have, you know, an extra four-lane build-out around the metropolitan area. That $20 billion number would go up probably another $10 billion if you're going to try to do that. So the recommendations from the Transportation Finance Advisory Committee are online with MnDOT and at the Met Council if you'd like to see the full report. Very comprehensive. We had business representatives from Target, from Polaris, Charlie Zelli, the new commissioner of MnDOT, from Jefferson Lines, from Marshall, Minnesota, from International Falls. We had people from Duluth. So it was really a statewide approach to the work. So I will be quiet now so you can hear from others, and then we'll be happy to answer questions when we get to the panel.
Thank you, Chair Haig, and thank you, Jay. My name is Will Schroer, and I represent and work for both the St. Paul area and the Minneapolis Regional Chamber of Commerce, and really, I should also have the TwinWest logo on here because I basically work for Judy as well. I am the first full-time or any amount of time actually appointment between the two chambers of commerce, and I sometimes joke that I'm the first one to have the two logos on a business card without it bursting into flame. But the two chambers are really committed to this issue, and I think the fact that their first formal collaboration was around accelerating investment in transit speaks to the need, as seen by our members, for additional transit investment in the region. And what I'd like to do this morning is to share with you our members' sense of that need, and it will complement, I think, the material that you just heard from Sue and from Jay. As I say, I work for the Minneapolis and St. Paul chambers and largely for Judy as well. We've also been joined in this particular effort by the Edina and Eden Prairie chambers as they joined to advocate for a regional transit solution. So when I meet people that don't spend as much time working on transit as some of us do, one of the first questions that I often get is about who actually uses the transit system here. And a lot of folks are surprised to find out that the system here essentially works to get people to work. And that 80% of all transit riders are going to either work or school. My boss, Todd Klingel at the Minneapolis Chamber, likes to say that if you're going to school, you're basically going to get ready for work. I have kids in school, and I hope they're getting more out of it than just workforce prep. But I understand that our workforce needs in the region are substantial, and that getting folks to school and getting those skills is absolutely essential to our vitality going forward. I almost always take the bus to work, the number 6 to downtown, and the folks on the 6 are doing one of 3 things, basically. They're either going to Target to work, and on Thursdays it's a sea of red on that bus, so they're going to work, or they're going to MCTC to get workforce skills, or they're going to the U to get workforce and other kinds of skills. So the 6, to me, is a little bit of a snapshot of what the transit system does for this region and community. It gets people to work today, and it gets them ready to work tomorrow. That's particularly true in downtown Minneapolis. Not that we like all kinds of jobs, but these are particular white-collar jobs, highly paid managerial folks that are choosing to take the bus, and it's mostly the bus because there's only the one light rail so far, to work. And Ameriprise values that access so heavily that back when it was American Express Financial Advisors, actually went to the Met Council and said, so many of our folks are on the bus, can you help us develop some sort of pass to make it more efficient for employees. And that was actually the very first sort of transit pass, employer-based transit pass system in the country, and at the behest of the employer. So that's today. And then most of our work helps folks think about the role of transit in the region tomorrow. And I, of course, commend to you Jay and Charlie's piece that's on your table. You may also want to go back and look at Sunday's editorial in the Star Trib that talks about how transit is essential to business growth going forward. So I often lead with the fact that transit makes a place like downtown Minneapolis absolutely possible. It couldn't exist without the access that transit makes possible. The next question is often, but okay, that's fine for downtown Minneapolis. Here in the suburbs, we have plenty of space. It turns out not to be true. Google Earth these days lets us verify statements that people make, not that we doubt them. But when SuperValue says our parking lot is full, we can go and verify that statement. So that's SuperValue, and they're in some difficulty right now, but they would continue to like to add jobs in that valuable location, whoever they end up, being. And they said, look, we're in the food business, we're not in the parking business, and we're not going to build a ramp. It's just too expensive to add parking at this location. If we get Southwest LRT, which would come behind them, then we will add jobs here, and if we don't, then we won't, because it's not a good business decision to do that. United Health, of course, has a lot of land, but they are going up because they don't have an infinite amount of land. They are choosing to go up, which is expensive because they have to. They're adding 4,000 and change jobs. They're adding 2,000 and change parking spaces. And that's pretty straightforward math. So they said, we are going to give land, valuable land, to the Met Council to put a light rail station on our campus, because that's the only way that we can continue to grow, just physically. It's also the only way that they can continue to attract the kind of talent that they need to continue to grow. The talent that they want to attract doesn't always want to have to drive to work. There's not a single pearl of talent out there. There's more than one talented person out there, obviously, but there's not an infinite number, right? And the sort of martial metaphors that we're at war for talent don't always work for me personally, but there is a limited amount of talent out there, and if we don't go for it, we can believe that other people certainly will. As Jay was saying, the vision of freedom is changing a little bit in the sense of how people interpret that in a transportation context. You may have seen this guy on a mailer that TwinWest did earlier this year, and that is really, it's not the only future, but it's a substantial part of the future of the workforce that we need. So this is something. It's not the only thing that people want, as Chair Haig and Jay said. It has to be part of a mix, but it's certainly one of the things that they want. And obviously, we've built a transportation system that helps people get downtown. One of the new mixes in the system needs to be people who live downtown and want to go work at United Health, and they want to do this on their way. The good news is that they don't only want rail. As I mentioned, I'm on the 6th. Most of the millennials are happy to take the bus if it's high-quality bus as well. And so that's good news for us because we can't build out an all-rail system. We don't want to. But the bottom line is that they want to see some kind of rich transit system when they decide where to live. So none of this is a secret, right? This presentation is being made by people like me to people like you all around the country, and has been made for years now. And our competitors see the same information and run with it and build out a rail system. So these are, to exactly the same scale, maps of fixed rail systems all around North America. Sometimes people look at this and they say, well, you're not really being very fair, Will, because we're not going to be New York, and you're just trying to make us look bad by putting New York up there. I'm not trying to make anyone look bad. I just think that, hey, we have a substantial publishing industry here. We compete with New York, which also has a substantial publishing industry, for talent. This is the map that millennials are looking at when they decide where to go, right? So this is the data. And if you don't want to have New York as a peer, maybe we can try and beat St. Louis, which right now we're not we're not doing very well at. So we need to catch up with our competitor regions, whichever set of regions you think that that is. So Denver, 10 years ago, saw this sort of data coming and decided to, they had the fastest single build out of a rail system in North America. Dallas has a much larger system, but they took a little bit longer to do. But Denver is now reaping the rewards from that investment. So Jay mentioned we took the intercity leadership visit there this fall, and they were, everybody that we talked to could not stop talking about the fact that they were the #1 destination for millennials, 2008 to 2010, the most recent period of data that exists. And everybody said that they are coming in large part for the transit. We're number 39. Now, anybody can quibble with any particular set of data. Maybe it's true that Denver's actually number 10 and we're actually number 20. That's still not a competitive situation for us. The other thing that they're reaping a return on investment in is the actual attraction of employers who want those millennials. So the U.S. Patent Office doesn't carry a particular brief for transit, but they need talented attorneys and technical, I don't know what you call them, but people that evaluate the technical merits of patents, right? So they're looking to get out of D.C. It's not efficient to fly everybody to D.C. for everything. So they looked around the country, where in the middle of the country can we put a new field office, and chose Denver in large part because of, and this is the Patent Office talking, their transit. Not, again, because they care about transit, but because their desired employees care about transit, right? And they are now reaping a remarkably large economic return from that. So we understand this in the two chambers. Our members understand it. When we surveyed our members this fall about their policy priorities, 93% of them told us that they wanted us to work on accelerating transit investment in the region, which is, even to me, a shockingly high number. But that's our members' view of their situation. And they understand that the uncertainty about when we're going to build the system out delays their ability to grow, and it delays other folks' ability to grow. So we really want to work with the legislature this year, work with other stakeholders to figure out, as Sue and Jay talked about, a way to stop going line by line, certainly not every 10 years, and really develop a competitive, fully built out integrated system. Doing public policy is sometimes an exercise in finding the right analogy, because people don't live and breathe the particular issue, whatever that issue is. I sometimes suggest that the regional competitiveness is a little bit like trying to design a new phone. You didn't used to have a camera in your phone to be competitive, and now you do, right? You might think that's silly. You didn't have to do it. It's hard to get used to the idea sometimes that there now needs to be a camera in a phone to sell it, but that's just the way it is. Markets change. Another analogy is, we're making a sort of a recipe here, and if you don't put in enough yeast or enough transit, then it doesn't grow as fast as you want it to. Different messages will work with different people, but the bottom line is that we don't have enough transit to have a competitive region at the moment, and we're losing out as a result of that. We're very secure in our message as business people that this is something that we need. We're also concerned that we're not out of step with everybody else. So we commissioned our own poll to find out what Minnesotans in general thought about this issue. Remarkable number of people statewide, so not just folks in the region that see buses and kind of get their value, statewide, most Minnesotans think that they need more transit, and if it were more available, would use it. And those numbers then go up in the 7-county metro, as you might imagine. So how should we pay for this investment? You heard the recommendations of the TFAC from Chair Haig. And then the last thing I'm going to do is to mention to you one last set of studies. There are a million studies. The county's Transit Improvement Board asked how others were going to, had successfully paid for their systems that we're competing against, and this is the same system that Sue and Jay said. And the first step that CTIB took was to make absolutely sure that we were getting as much out of our current stream of funding as we could, and came to the conclusion that there was room to more aggressively bond and to do more aggressive value capture around transit stations, et cetera. But those things were on the fringe. We don't have enough revenue to build out speedily or build out at all right now. And to catch up. So then they looked at our peer regions and asked how they have paid for their systems, and I commend their findings to you. They're important findings. I'm not going to go through all of them. We can talk about them if you like. I merely raise to your attention number 2 and number 6, because that is consistent with what the TFAC found as well, and they were looking at some of those same findings. So I'm in no way here to endorse a particular outcome at the moment in terms of a revenue mechanism, but in the spirit of the legislative breakfast being a source of information for you, I share with you this is what our peer competitive regions are doing, and if we want to catch up to them, then we have to take a hard look at these things ourselves. So I have to click through all these here. You heard from Sue about how TFAC interpreted that set of findings, and I think with that, we're in a position now where you have a lot of information. You've heard a variety of different cases, the hard business numbers case, the competitiveness case, and then the just keeping up with population and economic growth case from Chair Haig. So why don't we leave it there and have some conversation around this, and we'll start that conversation by hearing from Senator Terry Bonoff and her reactions to where we are. Senator.
Thank you very much. Hear that? Okay. Very good. Thank you very much. Again, I'm Terry Bonoff, and I represent Minnetonka and Plymouth in the legislature. And the first time I heard this recommendation was when I was on a panel at the Minneapolis Chamber, and I had read the report prior to that, but I didn't get the punchline until I was actually sitting in this chair, and that was about the sales tax. So that was quite a surprise to actually read the bold recommendations as I was reacting to it. So now I've had some time to think about it. But I will tell you that I'm a believer in terms of the importance of transit, and have felt that way for some time, and recalled that even in my first special election, I put a picture of a train running down the tracks, and that was because I have had this vision or imagination that we would turn the BNSF rail freight line that goes from the stadium all the way out to the Wayzata Depot, that we would turn that into a commuter corridor. So I always have to mention that because I'm not willing to give up that little dream, and we haven't yet studied it. I would let data decide whether or not that was a good idea, but I do think that we ought to study that. And part of my belief that it's so important is both about the young generation. I have 4 kids ages 28 to 22, and I know how important they feel transit is. I've got 2 living in DC and 1 on the West Coast, and then 1 here maybe I'll get to keep. I don't know if he'll stay here. But also for our senior population, as you look at the changing demographics, one of the most important things to keep our seniors in their homes is their ability to be independent and to have mobility as they age with dignity and with respect. And I think that's something that we all owe our seniors. So I'm a fan of the plan, and then there's the how do you pay for it. So I just wanted to say a few things about that, because it will be us in the legislature grappling with that question, how do we pay for it? And we'll be doing that in a pretty complicated environment, because we've got the deficit that we are grappling with, and we've all committed to not just solve this thing for this time, for this cycle, but in fact to put us on some solid financial footing where that isn't the subject of every single conversation for the next 10 years, but in fact that we put forward a strong financial plan. And so one of the keys in doing that will be, if you recall, those of you who are here to hear Commissioner Franz, will be the tax reform effort. And within the tax reform effort, one of the most key tools that we have is reforming the base of the the sales tax, because right now, as Commissioner Franz showed us, we've got the smallest leg of the stool is on the sales tax because we have such a narrow base. So now here we have Senator Ann Rest, who his new role in the Senate is to be the chair of the Tax Reform Division. And so I know that she is working very hard to analyze, and we'll be working with her committee and be working with those in the House to look at just what does it mean to truly have a balanced approach to funding, what is the role of the sales tax, what should be in that base, and at the same time, how can we lower it as we go forward to make sure that we are economically competitive? So that's the environment that this is coming into. So now here we have this charter called tax reform, and within that, expanding the base of the sales tax, and then a call for tax neutrality so that we're not raising things as, you know, as we go forward on a charge to be more efficient and more competitive in our region, and now we're being asked to again raise the sales tax. So I'm not saying that it's a bad idea, I'm saying it's a pretty dicey approach in this competitive environment. Now maybe Senator Rest will find so many different inputs to put in that sales tax and keep the rate low that she'll say, oh, it's fine, and that'll be easy. But I suspect it won't quite be that easy. And so then the question is also about bonding. What is the role of bonding in regard to transit? And I think right now the bonding is pretty attractive because the rates are historically low, and we do leverage funds from the county, we leverage funds from the feds, and so the investment from the state perspective is, you know, something that probably could be done with bonding. Now, this is not a bonding year, so that's another complicating factor. If you look at the forecast, I believe it's $250 million is in the forecast for potential bonding dollars this session. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't do a little bit this session and then more next when it is a traditional bonding year, but that's one approach. Another thing that we should look at, and then I have the question is, so bonding, in my view, should be about infrastructure. So that's another question I have with regard to the sales tax thing is, we're talking about, you know, light rail lines that are going to serve our community for decades to come. Is that, you know, I understand that those cities did sales tax. I suspect they did that because that's all they could get done politically. So I'm still not certain that's the smartest way to invest in infrastructure. Perhaps with operating, that's different because that's a day-to-day cost. But then there's this little piece of money that's floating around that I never miss an occasion to mention with regard to transit funding, and that is, do you all recall when the business community championed the MVEST constitutional amendment to say that when we bought a car, the tax that we paid on that car went directly to transportation funding? So y'all remember, you were the leaders in making sure that amendment passed. Okay, so that's when you buy your car. How many in this room, and I asked the same question at the Minneapolis Chamber, how many in this room lease their cars versus just buy them outright? Raise your hand if you lease your car. Okay, so it's not that many. I think it's really changed in the 5 years since I've been asking that question. So perhaps the numbers aren't going to be as good. But there was a wrinkle when we did that MVEST original constitutional amendment that we didn't include the sales of leased cars. And so back then, when we looked at that number, it was $45 million a year. We've still never done the legislation that would move that lease tax money to transportation. And to me, and at the time, as I said, $45 million a year, that would be pretty significant to perhaps be a help in this whole equation of how do you fund transit. So I mentioned that. But if, in fact, leasing is going to go down like that, then it's probably not such a good idea. So I guess in summary, what I would say is that I don't have a conclusion about the best way. I think that there will be thoughtful discussions in both the Senate and the House, and that we do owe the business community, because I thank Jay and I thank Charlie and the council and for their tremendous work that you've done on this and for your report, which I find fascinating and illuminating that there is such consensus in the business community around the importance of this, and I'm pleased with that. So I think we owe everybody an answer to this. I just think that that we should do it thoughtfully and make sure that we do it in the context of the overall budget reform. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Jan Callis. I'm the County Commissioner for a little bit west of here, 14 western suburban communities. I'm pleased to be here, pleased that you asked for a local perspective. Thanks for including us. You may guess that Senator Bonoff and I are on the same wavelength this morning. We've coordinated our wardrobe, and so we may have similar comments, but I want to make just a couple of points. First, these systems that we're talking about, these transit lines, are really being developed by the local units of government. So the counties, Metropolitan Council has been a partner. These have not been the state of Minnesota looking at what's good for this region and working with us to develop the transit corridors we need. So this has been locally propelled, if you will. Certainly the Hiawatha was, Central Corridor, Southwest, and now Bottineau. And it's great to have the partnership with the business community. It's great to have this information about what the return on investment is, what the importance of it is. It's great to have the numbers, and I really want to commend those of you who have been working on it. When we get to the financing side of it, I have to admit I have this sneaking suspicion that this is just another example of the state of Minnesota saying, we're not going to pay for this stuff anymore. You locals, you pay for it. You do the sales tax. We certainly get the benefit as the state. I mean, look at those numbers about what this region means to the state of Minnesota in terms of economic competitiveness, and know that when we grow jobs and we grow businesses, we grow the sales tax, the income tax, the state property, or the business property tax. And the state of Minnesota benefits tremendously from what goes on in this region. And it'd be great to have the state as financial partner as well. And certainly for Southwest, we've asked the state to step up and be that financial partner to the tune of $125 million. And that's been a tough sell. And so now we're talking about the sales tax, and that may be the right answer. I mean, maybe practically speaking, we're at a point as we finance these things that we can no longer expect the state of Minnesota to come in for $125 million to help build out a line that's going to benefit the entire population of this state. But I'm a little reluctant to go there. So it's just going to take some more conversation, as Senator Bonoff indicated, to understand what the roles are, what the right way to finance all this is. The other point I'd like to make, and this is because I've got my county commission hat on, is while we talk about jobs and economic competitiveness, I always like to go back to what a job means for a person, because that's really what it comes down to. And it means they have a place to live because they can pay rent or a mortgage. It means they have health insurance. It means they can send their child to college or another school. And it means economic independence that a lot of us take for granted, but when they don't have it, the state and the county step in to make sure that people are able to provide for their families and themselves. And so these jobs that we talk about are really important for the people of this region, and I really want to commend you for keeping a focus on how important it is that we have a thriving regional economy. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Judy and I are going to sort of team moderate this panel now. So Judy has the mic, and I'll, if I don't like the question, I'll reword it. But let's take a first question, and it looks like we have, right, Judy?
Jeff Washy, who is the chair of the Plymouth Rotary Business Council at TwinWest, also a council member in the city of Plymouth, and has previously chaired and serves on the Transportation Advisory Committee for Plymouth. So here we go.
Thanks, Judy. I had a question. When you are looking at comprehensive planning, so not just transit, but also looking at transportation needs of the region, and you look at a number of projects that have gone a long time not being funded, and I can't help but point out, on 494 there where it's only 2 lanes, talking about the needs of that, 610, not just, I use that as an example, but getting a congestion relief lane up there, because I know for Plymouth businesses, that's the #1 issue we have is all the employees from Rogers, Maple Grove, trying to get through here. Plus for the city, they're using our city roads to take shortcuts down until they get to the businesses. And so it's putting wear and tear on our streets as well. So just kind of providing those needs versus what we've seen, what goals and objectives are for transit.
So before I let Chair Higgs say something, I'm so glad you stood up and said that, because I really wanted to grab the microphone and say one more thing and say it to Chair Higgs, because you spoke about in your comments about that your plan didn't include this, fourth lane around, and I wanted to make sure that everybody understands that the section from 394 up through Plymouth, never got expanded. It didn't get finished because the project ran out of money, and then it's like it went back to the back of the queue, and that didn't seem like the appropriate answer, that you have a project on the drawing board, you go 3/4 of the way, you don't get done, and then you say, oh, sorry, now you're at the back of the line. And so we in our community live with the frustration of that congestion every single day, and people actually route their schedules around it. They plan different routes, and it's a very, very pressing problem for our community.
Well, I want to make sure, whoa, I think I better do this one. All right. I want to make sure and clarify that my original comment was to let you know that the projections for the additional gas tax and the additional road needs are to meet what we would consider to be the economically competitive scenario that I described to you, which would include the type of additional lane investment at this particular location that you mentioned. What I was trying to suggest is to build additional lanes in a metropolitan area is a very, very costly proposition. We won't be able to build that investment without the additional money for roads. That's why the Transportation Finance Advisory Committee is making this recommendation for the investment in roads. I know we were talking a lot today about transit, but that is a critical roads investment that would be very, very important for the region.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here and point out one other thing which I think is relevant to the question, which is that if we don't raise new revenues, we're not, the not raising revenues doesn't necessarily save us money. Those costs come out someplace else. So if you're not building that additional lane to relieve that highway congestion, the cost moves to the local street system. That street system then has to be upgraded with property taxes, right? So you can come up with the analogy of your choice for, whether, you squeeze it one place and it comes out someplace else, but those costs don't necessarily go away in the absence of a funding option. Other reactions to that question? Okay.
We have another question from former Senator Ed Oliver, who is also active in our Government Affairs Committee.
Yes, as I was watching your slides and so forth, the question that came to my mind is, how do you service existing corporate campuses? And I'm thinking of General Mills in the west, Medtronic in the north, Minnesota Mining on the east, excuse me. That's my question.
Well, as we created the transportation policy plan for the region, I'm assuming your question is both about transit and roads, or is primarily about transit? Transit. One of the critical things that we look at as we look at the competitiveness of a particular alternative transit investment, a transitway investment. For example, there's an alternatives analysis going on right now in the East Metro, what's called the Gateway Corridor, which would go from downtown St. Paul out through Woodbury and then would address the 3M campus. Those are very, very important because those are, of course, great job centers, and that produces a lot of ridership, and then that makes that line much more cost-effective and competitive. So, yes, those are absolutely considerations as we look at the most competitive investments for transitways. That's one of the reasons the Southwest corridor here is so competitive, because there are so many jobs in this corridor, and that makes that line much more cost-effective. And in fact, of all of the components of our integrated transit system, light rail, commuter rail, bus, BRT, the Hiawatha light rail line on an operating cost is probably the most cost-effective line that we have because of the ridership is so high.
We have time for
you,
one
Chair.
more
Judy?
question,
Yep.
and maybe we can have people stay afterwards and ask questions too. We encourage
Sure,
that.
yeah.
We have Dan Duffy, who's been a longtime TwinWest member and active in government affairs, and also served for about the past 10 years studying if there is a good business case behind Southwest Light Rail.
Thanks, Judy. My question is, what do you think are the chances of getting any bonding funding this year in the next session that would help us to leverage the federal dollars that we would need later on down the road?
Well, thank you, Dan. I suspect that's directed to me. Well, again, I mentioned that there's a pretty small amount that's in the forecast for bonding because it's a budget year and next year's the bonding year. So I would hope that we could look at it on a 2-year cycle and perhaps get, I would advocate to get a portion of it in this bonding bill to demonstrate to the feds that we're serious about our commitment, and if there has to be a follow-up amount the next year, that would be the route that I would look to go to. But I think the state, there's a lot of support among the new legislators. You've got, Melissa Franzen sitting here, Yvonne Seltzer, and those folks told the people in their community supporters and would be going to their new roles advocating for that. So I think the chances are looking better than ever.
I'm happy to hear that. That's great news. As you know, just to recap for those of you who may not remember these numbers, we need a total of $125 million in state in GO bonds. We've raised the state has committed $9 million total, 5 and 2, $7 million. So we have a long ways to go to get the remaining $118 million. We are beginning preliminary engineering in that project now. We are able to complete that preliminary engineering within a 2-year cycle, and we could begin construction in 2015 if we can get the state bonding share for this project. The money that we need for the state share is absolutely critical. This is a competitive project. Federally, there's 50% federal share funding for the project, 30% local property tax funding from the county, 30% quarter-cent sales tax from CTIB, and then the remaining 10% comes from local property taxes from Hennepin County Rail Authority. So the state share is absolutely critical for us to move forward. If we do not get that share and we do not know where that money is coming from, it's going to be very hard for us to advance that project.
And let me just add, there's a clock ticking because the federal government has an expectation about when that local match will be committed so that the project goes forward. There are other projects in the country, you saw the map, that are asking for federal funds. They won't wait forever for us to get our house in order.
And I also want to point out that Representative Earhart is chair of transportation policy in the House, so I think that will help us as well. And I do want to thank Judy and all of those at TwinWest who made such a strong statement in support of this and for your work with the other 2 chambers. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that we're at 9 o'clock, and I just want to thank the panelists and ask you to join me in thanking them for coming out this morning.